Check out more economic wit at swifteconomics.com.
Now to the 30s and the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, accepting the Democratic nomination for president July 2nd, 1932, quote, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people, close quote. In a sentence or two, define the New Deal.
Direct connection from the federal government right to the individual involving a flow of funds plus confidence,
All right.
strong leadership.
All right. Rexford Tugwell, one of FDR's principal advisors and one of the most compelling portraits in The Forgotten Man, quote, practically the whole New Deal was extrapolated from programs that Hoover started, close quote. Absolutely critical point. Did the New Deal represent something new in American history, a departure from the norms and standards of American government to that point, or was it merely a step or two along a continuum that had already been established?
Well, Roosevelt went much farther than TR. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt would be earlier progressives, Wilson, and certainly Hoover would go. Roosevelt was unconstitutional. They were mostly constitutional, so that's the difference. But the impulse, it was a strong impulse in American culture, the impulse of progressivism, and there it was. Roosevelt didn't believe in states. If you look at the discussion by FDR, instead what he did, he was a governor. Why didn't he believe in states? Because he made America his own one state. He was governor of New York. He you could take the Tugwell quote, everything we did, we took from Hoover, and there are people like Bernard Bellish who've written books. Everything Roosevelt did, he took from what he tried already in New York. He just expanded the mandate he assigned to himself, including Francis Perkins, for example, as labor secretary, and he made it national. And whether that was constitutional or not was less interesting to FDR, and given the strength of
So what you're saying is that this impulse, it's really, there's a kind of emotional, we'll come to the intellectual underpinnings in a moment, but there's a kind of emotional impulse. The government must do, it must connect with the people. And you see that much earlier in American history. You see it right after the turn of the century with Theodore Roosevelt. But when you come to the Depression, the constraints disappear.
Well, it's just like Katrina. It's like what's happening in China right now. All bets are off when you have a crisis and a disaster.
Right.
You move to that part of the brain that is the disaster mode part of the brain, and you do stuff that you normally wouldn't do, and maybe it's warranted and maybe it's not.
Right.
They use the excuse of the emergency of the Depression to expand the federal government mightily.
All right. Now,
That too.
let me quote you in The Forgotten Man again. Quote, to justify giving to one forgotten man, the administration found it had to make a scapegoat of another. Roosevelt and his staff were becoming habitual bullies, pitting Americans against one another. Tell the story of the National Recovery Act and the Schechter family.
This is a story I stumbled on, and I fell so much in love with it that I thought, well, this is the book. We'll forget about the rest of the book. The Schechters were, the center left has their famous lawsuit, Gideon's Trumpet, Gideon v. Wainwright. This is the conservatives' Gideon v. Wainwright. The Schechters were small businessmen. They were chicken butchers in Brooklyn. They didn't speak English very well. They were quite religious. And they were the authors of the New Deal and the National Recovery Administration, which was the law that was the centerpiece of the New Deal. We have our NRA. They had their NRA. Had written this very strong law to govern all aspects of the business economy. And it was quite questionable whether it was constitutional, and they knew that. So they sought out a case to test its constitutionality, set up a case they thought they could win. And they picked these little chicken butchers. And one reason they picked them is the chicken butchers barely spoke English, so they were an easy
have their
target.
way with them. Right.
There was a sort of cultural bigotry component in those days. Bigotry was much more obvious in those days. They were little Jewish chicken butchers, and the big lawsuit came from the Justice Department, which had no accent, spoke good English. Their business had already been established to be racketeering interstate, so therefore, Commerce Clause might not be a problem. And they were very surprised to be set up. They were set up, and they were charged with many, many counts of violating a law. And some of the violations, these crimes that were alleged, were crazy as concepts, such as your prices are too low.
Prices are too low.
Your prices
Consumers
are
were
too
able to go in and choose their own chicken.
Consumers could choose their own chicken. That was against the rules. Can't choose your own chicken under the New Deal. Your people work too much, like that.
Right.
You're paying them too little, the minimum wage. All these rules that they were breaking, and they were astounded because this is an industry, the economy's under inconceivable stress, their industry is under inconceivable stress. And what was so wonderful about the testimonies all came out there. The lawyers say, "Oh, you didn't pay enough," and they said, "Well, I paid as much as I could." I'm paraphrasing. Or you're not the lawyer said, "You're not a real economist. You're not an agricultural economist," pulling the class rank on the little chicken. And one of the people in the business said, "Well, I may not be an economist, but I'm an economizer, and I know."
So the Justice Department chose, in the Schechters, they chose the wrong people to bully.
They
goes
chose
all the
them.
way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules the National Recovery Act unconstitutional.
The Schechters win.
And the Schechters win. Okay, now so we have established, and your contention is that kind of bullying takes place throughout the economy.
Well, that's the story that I found most emblematic and important. But when you think of Markets TV today, Peter, and we look at who our stars are, a Greenspan, a Bill Gates.
Right.
And you can imagine if you're watching Markets TV, if all of a sudden Eliot Spitzer came back and he were Attorney General, and he decided to target Greenspan very aggressively, and also Gates, not just about the one little antitrust thing, but in a very big way, as an evil man. In the parallel in that day was they targeted their Greenspan, who was Mellon, Andrew Mellon, the former Treasury Secretary, a figure as august, more august in the mind of the market than Greenspan. And they targeted a man named Sam Insull, who was very important to their industry. So constant culture of prosecution.
Roosevelt's phrase, malefactors of great wealth, pointing the finger at business figures. This changes American culture, and suddenly business finds itself on the defensive in a kind of systematic way, right?